you know, it sucks so bad when you find a book with a great premise and then the execution really falls flat. But, like, what are the chances that there are two? Hello, friends. Happy October. My name is Jamie, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I just think that I want to take some time to rant. So before I get too deep into things, I just want to throw a couple things out there. First of all, this is going to be a little bit of a rant video, so if those are not really your thing, click away. And secondly, if one or both of these books are books that you really love, that's great, and like nothing against anybody who likes these books. Obviously, reading is super subjective. I mean, like, it happens all the time, right? Like, I have booktubers that I adore and that I trust their opinions with my whole heart, and then I'll watch a video where they hate my favorite book. And, like, it's okay. Like, it is fine. Reading is the most subjective thing, I think, ever. I am continually shocked at how varied people's tastes and opinions can be. Even if someone has the exact same reading taste as you, their opinions might widely differ from yours on a certain genre or book or author or whatever. So this is all in good fun, okay? That's what I'm trying to say. Like, if you love these books, I'm so happy that you love them, and that's the end of that. These are just my personal thoughts, just after having read one of them very recently. So yeah, I just have to rant about this. Also, this is your official spoiler warning. There will be spoilers in this video for both The Cabin at the End of the World and Leave the World Behind. So if you don't want spoilers for either of those books, read the books and then come back and watch this video. Okay, so have you ever come across a premise for a book or a movie or a TV show or anything that is just perfect for you? Like, exactly what you want in a premise. And I'm not talking like, oh, it's a really good premise. Like, I mean that it is perfect for you, for your taste. Like, if someone could write a thing that felt like it was made for you, like, this is what it would be. Well, I did find that premise, and interestingly, I didn't find it once, but twice. I mean, how did I get so lucky, right? Unfortunately, both books that have this amazing premise did not end up working super well for me. For those of you that are unfamiliar with either or both of these stories, I'll just give a quick overview of the premise, because that is what we're talking about today. They both have very similar premise, at least like the starting concept. The kernel and the idea is really similar. Both of these books involve a family that go on vacation to a remote cabin in the woods, and they are having a great time. They're having the time of their lives, like enjoying their vacation, when all of a sudden they hear a knock on their cabin door. And in both stories, strangers show up at their door telling the family that the world outside is experiencing an apocalypse. And in both stories, the families that are staying at the cabin have to determine whether or not the strangers are telling the truth or if they are lying to try to get something from the family or harm them in some way. From there, the books differ quite a bit, and the tone is different. They're not really the same, aside from the premise, but it's still pretty insane that they have such similar premises. What I was expecting from both of them was a tense psychological thriller where we have to parse out what is being told to us by the strangers and figure out whether or not to believe them and what are the consequences of believing them versus not. That is promised in both of these stories, but as we will find out, it doesn't quite happen. Okay, this is it. This is the time. We are getting into spoiler territory here, so if you do not want to hear any more about what happens in these novels, and especially the ending, time to press pause, zip through them, come back. But this is it. We are going into spoiler territory now. The main difference between these two books is the tone. In Leave the World Behind, it's almost kind of airy and just it's a little bit odd because our family is approached by strangers, and the strangers claim that they are the owners of the cabin, and they're telling the family there's an apocalypse, like something's going on, we don't know what it is, but we packed up our car and we drove out here because we thought it was the most safe, so like you need to let us in and like all that. And the family is a little bit worried, but overall, like it's very quick that you do determine that these strangers are telling the truth. Like they just have too much proof that they are who they say they are. It's very fast, and I was kind of expecting a much more tense experience where there's just constant doubt, but that doubt is alleviated almost immediately, and from there you get a story that is just the family and the two owners of the cabin kind of commingling while they wait for either the world to end or for someone to get some answers. And then there's like a little bit of like ominous events, but nothing is really clear, and the focus of the novel is not really on the apocalypse or survival or anything like that. Like it's just these two families trying to not freak out, I guess. And it's very short. It's a quick read, and it is a little bit eerie, but mostly it just feels kind of otherworldly. And I do know that quite a lot of people do enjoy this book, and I can see why, because it's a fun concept for sure. But for me, it didn't really work because I felt that we were let down in the premise like so early. And I've noticed this a lot, book jackets will lie or just bend the truth a little bit about what the book actually is, because it's trying to get you to pick it up. It's trying to sell you the book. But really, the focus is not on determining whether the strangers are telling the truth, and that is where I wanted the majority of the book to sit. The Cabin at the End of the World, I just read this weekend, prompting this whole discussion because I was so surprised that it was so similar to Leave the World Behind, and I really didn't actually, even from reading the book jacket synopsis of what was going on, I did not make that connection to Leave the World Behind, because this is a horror novel, and the tone here is much more horror, action. I don't really want to say tense, because this is where we're going with this discussion. It's not exactly tense all of the time, but it's definitely much more gruesome, much more violent. It just is more immediate in all of the effects. So basically, the strangers that are coming to the door, they are telling the family that either they must choose to sacrifice one member of their family, and it has to be willingly, like they must willingly kill another member of their family, or the apocalypse will happen. And in this novel, again, you're trying to figure out, are the strangers telling the truth, or are they just crazy? But, and it is the case in both of these, it just becomes entirely too apparent too quickly that the strangers don't really have any reason to lie. Both of these books try to be ambiguous with the ending. It's unclear whether or not the apocalypse is actually happening, but it doesn't feel ambiguous. It feels obnoxious. And it is tried through like various means of argument to convince you that there could be a way that the strangers are lying in this story. I just don't think it ever really gets there because I just wasn't really convinced. A big portion of this book is that the 4 strangers, if the family does not choose to make a sacrifice, they kill one of their 4. So every time that the family doesn't make the choice to kill each other, which obviously they wouldn't, another one of the members of the 4 gets killed. And there's never really a moment that can potentially explain why the strangers would go to those lengths and kill each other. It tries to make an argument for it, but it doesn't, in my opinion, work at all. And similar to the reason that it doesn't work in this book is because in both cases, the strangers are sympathetic for the most part, or they don't ever really present as people who are lying, and you could make an argument, oh, well, they're really good liars, but it just, they have so much proof. They have proof of what they're doing, and they don't have any motivations. Like in Leave the World Behind, the strangers are they're not trying to steal anything or harm the family in any way, so why would they be lying? And then in Cabin at the End of the World, the strangers actually end up killing themselves because the choice is not made. So again, what would be their motivation for doing that if they were lying? It's not to say that these books don't try to make arguments for why they would be lying, but they just fall so flat in comparison to the rest of the information that we have. And what was especially frustrating about this book is that our family, our protagonists, do not ask for any further information. And look, I have never been held hostage in a cabin under the threat of death, so I don't know how I would react, but I would think that if someone comes in, bursting into your home and is like, you need to either choose someone in your family to kill, or the apocalypse is going to happen and we're going to kill this other person, like, you would be asking, like, first of all, like, what are you talking about? Like, who is forcing this choice? Like, where are you getting this information? Like, all these things, and the characters never really ask that, at least not in a sincere way. There's one of the main characters kind of asks in a joking way, like, oh, like, who's telling you this? Your God? Like, why would I believe, like, it's just not sincere. Like, he's not trying to gather information, he's actually trying to, like, antagonize them, which it doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. In this one, once they basically determine that the strangers are who they say they are, they're just believed at that point. There's no issue of trust. There's no point in which we learn something that could contradict who they say they are. There's nothing like that. And I get that this isn't maybe not, what the author wanted to do with that story, but still, it just brings up the question of why, if that's going to be your premise, why is this the direction that you're taking with it? For me, both of these really are lacking a strong core theme that is kind of the thread through the whole story. And it's not to say that every book needs a big, like, thematic, like, overarching idea or anything like that. Like, this is just a fun little horror book. Like, they're not meant to have these big discussions. But I don't believe that Paul Tremblay was just trying to write a book that was completely devoid of themes, because in here it kind of wants to talk about religion a little bit, because one of the main characters is a man who grew up Catholic and he is deeply religious, and his husband is agnostic, and he believes that the strangers are some sort of quasi-Christian death cult, again, with no evidence or anything to go on, because he doesn't ask them. Like, he does not try to get information out of them. And the strangers themselves say, no, like, we just saw these visions, like something, someone, I guess a god, but also like we don't know if it's a particular religious god. Like we were just given these visions. And the agnostic protagonist takes this to mean that they are insane. And his husband, who's Catholic, does actually start to believe that they're telling the truth about the apocalypse, because one of the things that they do is that to try to prove that the apocalypse actually is happening is that they, in certain intervals or whatever, they show on the TV all these like catastrophic things happening, like massive floods that like destroy cities, and like a plague, and like all the airplanes start falling out of the sky. And so our Catholic protagonist does actually start to believe them, and his husband kind of just takes this to mean that he's also being brainwashed and kind of going insane. All of this is to say is that it does want to broach the topic of religion. It just doesn't really go anywhere with it, because it basically just says like, well, yep, he's Christian, but it's still unclear whether or not he's hallucinating, delusional, or if this is real. You would think that with a religious through line that there would be some theme about hope, blind faith, even sacrifice to some degrees. They are told that they need to sacrifice somebody, but that is not really discussed, and what that sacrifice would mean or anything like that. Like this, it just doesn't seem that the book really has any interest in diving into any themes involving religion. This book is basically completely devoid of themes. Like, it just is a series of things that happen. Like, popping in here to say that it's probably a little bit unfair to say that Leave the World Behind is devoid of themes, because it does try to do an interesting discussion about race, because the owners of the cabin are a black couple and the vacationers are a white family. And when the owners come knocking on the door, the wife of the family that's vacationing there has a kind of moment of distrust. And it does an interesting thing where it plays with the white characters having just an immediate, like, fearful and distrustful relationship to the black characters. But this is so short. Like, this really is not taken farther than a couple of lines at most. But I did want to mention it is in there, and it's an interesting idea that I really wish would have been explored further. So thinking about that, both of these books have semi-ambiguous endings. And I say semi because it seems, I mean, with all the information that we're given, like, it seems to point that the apocalypse is occurring in both of these novels. So I think that the idea was that it was ambiguous, but there just would be no other rational explanation for the kinds of things that occur in the book, if not for the actual apocalypse. Again, they do try to argue some logic of, like, how the strangers could have predicted the flood. And, well, the pandemic was already kind of, like, incoming. Like, they already kind of knew there was, like, an illness that was being spread. And they don't really have an answer for the airplanes. It's not, like, a one-for-one argument where you're, like, you could really see both sides. It's just too obvious that it is, in fact, the apocalypse. Especially because the strangers in both novels just don't ever really present as delusional or crazy in any way. Like, they are following the rational direction of thoughts and emotions. And it gets into really tricky territory if you are going to write characters that are mentally unwell, or they have some sort of delusion or mental illness. But I don't think that in either of these two cases that is what's going on. So thinking about themes, or lack thereof, in connection with the intended ambiguous endings, like, let's think, when does an ambiguous ending work, or why? Well, for me, I think an ambiguous ending works when either ending that you can come up with in your head of like, okay, here are the different ways it could potentially go and we're not told. If both of those options extrapolate on a theme and say something different about the themes, if each conclusion you could come to says something different about the themes, I think that's a really great ambiguous ending, because then the personal beliefs and experience that you had while reading the book might lead you to a certain conclusion. And that's really interesting when you're talking about how different people react to different themes and concepts in the book. For me, because there was really no theme in either of these, the ambiguous ending just didn't mean anything to me. There was nothing to extrapolate from whether or not there was an apocalypse, because neither of these books was trying to say anything about there being an apocalypse. And again, I know that not every single book has to say something specific or has to land on a big thematic finish. I just don't understand why these authors would take a premise which the central tension of it is, can you trust these strangers, and would you trust a stranger if your life, and in this case, the lives of every other human being on the planet depended on it? Is the theme of that not faith and trust and the greater good? That's really what this book keeps talking about is, well, for the greater good, you have to sacrifice yourself. Well, that's a thematic road you could go down. And ultimately, though it is ambiguous as to whether or not the apocalypse actually happens, a choice is made at the end of the book. Spoiler alert, they choose not to kill each other. And by doing that, they presumably bring on the apocalypse. So what is that choice saying about our characters? Hey, it's me again. Okay, so I was rambling and I think I lost my train of thought here, but basically what I was trying to say was that even though, yes, there is a choice at the end, they choose not to make the sacrifice, so presumably the apocalypse happens, and that seems like there is something thematic in there to say. It does a little bit, but why it didn't work for me was that because we actually didn't know whether or not the apocalypse actually happened, because it was ambiguous, the choice was not about them choosing each other over the rest of the world. It was just them being well, I hope everybody's fine, The choice was not a super active one because of the ambiguous ending. For me, these books come pre-packaged with so much tension right in the premise. In both situations, showing us that the strangers are who they say they are and that they are telling us the truth, that absolves ourselves and the characters from ever really having to think about what their choice means for themselves, for other people, and I just think that it was just such a wasted opportunity in both cases. I don't know. I ended up giving both of these books, I think, a 2 to 2.75 stars. I didn't actively hate the reading experience of reading these books. I'm not mad, I'm disappointed, we really had such a good premise, but the tension was just immediately sucked away because it became unambiguous as to what the strangers were talking about, and then at the end, both of them try to leave us with this ambiguous ending of whether there is or is not an apocalypse, but because we've already pushed away the tension that comes from the characters deciding whether or not they're going to trust these people, it doesn't mean anything to us as the reader when it turns out that there's probably most likely an apocalypse. I've rambled on long enough, and I hope that any of what I said makes sense. Basically, I just thought that it was really strange that I read two books with such a similar premise, and though this one was a violent horror novel, and this was a weird thriller in a way, I don't really know what to classify this as, but even though they took slightly different routes, they still ended up coming to the same ending, which in both of them is supposed to be ambiguous, but is mostly just meaningless. Is that rude to say? I think that there could have been so much tension and character development and reflection in our characters trying to parse out why someone would lie about something like this. And that could have been a lot of fun. But in both situations, it just did not occur. So anyway, thank you guys for listening to me rant about this. I hope that there is a book out there that maybe it's, if it's not this exact premise, it's something similar. I hope there's a book out there that really scratches that itch for me, because I was looking forward to both of these and they both just kind of landed a little flat. They did not know what to do with the great premise that they had, and it just seemed a little bit obvious. In both of these, I felt like the author was kind of having their cake and eating it too. Felt a little bit lazy, like the author really couldn't decide if they wanted to actually have an apocalypse and like deal with the consequences of that. It just kind of felt like, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. We don't know. We don't have to explain anything, because who cares? So let me know in the comments down below if you can think of any books that might be more along the lines of what I was thinking these two things were going to be. And let me know what you thought of either of or both of these books. Did you like them? Because like I said, if you did like them, that's great. I want to know what worked for you. And by the way, like I said earlier, I will pick up another Paul Tremblay because I actually enjoyed the writing in this for the majority of it. It does a super weird perspective shift at the end, and I don't know why that was necessary. That really, I think that choice was a little bit odd, but for the most part, I think this was much better written than many horror thrillers that I've read. So I will pick up Paul Tremblay again. And you know what? If Rumaan ever writes another thing, I don't know if they have or not, but I'll keep my eye out because I am curious. Both of them created a fun, tense environment in the first chapter. I just wish it would have gone on a little bit longer. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a lovely, lovely day.